generator or I'm calling the police.
My neighbor's dying without her oxygen machine.
Not my problem. You're disturbing the peace.
It's an ice storm. She's 84 years old.
Rules are rules. No exceptions.
Your friends all have generators running.
They got permits.
So you cut my power cables while she was gasping for air?
Yeah, so what?
You just killed an elderly woman to enforce a noise complaint.
Prove it.
Oh, I will. Along with your $50,000 embezzlement scheme. And congratulations, by cutting my power, you just handed me manual control of every basement sump pump in this neighborhood. Hope you can swim.
Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in a war with the most vindictive HOA president in American suburbia. My name's Rex Holloway, 52 years old, retired Navy electrical engineer, and apparently public enemy number one for having the audacity to keep my family from freezing to death. 6 months ago, my wife Sarah rang the cancer-free bell at the hospital. Best sound I've ever heard in my life. Unfortunately, the medical bills rang up a different tune. Complete financial devastation. We needed to downsize fast, which is how we found this little ranch house in Willowbrook Heights. Perfect location, decent bones, and most importantly, it sat on the highest elevation in the neighborhood. As an engineer, I appreciated that advantage. During my Navy days, I'd learned that controlling the high ground means controlling everything below it, a lesson that would prove more valuable than I imagined. The smell of fresh paint and sawdust still hung in the garage when Cheryl Blackwood materialized at my door 3 days after moving in. HOA president for 8 years running, real estate agent, drives a white BMW with Blessed One plates. She clutched a clipboard like it was a sacred text, her aggressive perfume creating a chemical warfare situation with the honest scent of wood shavings from my unpacked tools. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she purred, though her tone suggested I was more like an invasive species threatening the local ecosystem. "I need to discuss some compliance issues with your property." Compliance issues? I'd been living there exactly 72 hours. Had I committed some architectural war crime by existing? My workshop shed, built by the previous owner, documented in every inspection report, was allegedly 2 inches too close to the property line. Now, I've calibrated missile guidance systems where 2 inches meant the difference between hitting a target and hitting civilians. This was nothing. I grabbed my tape measure, the metal tape making that familiar snap as it extended. 4 inches inside the compliance zone. Perfect. I showed Cheryl the measurements, the permits, even the county inspection certificates. She studied my evidence with the same expression most people reserve for flat earth theories. "The board will review this," she announced, then slapped me with a $50 a day violation notice anyway. That's when I made my first mistake. I did some homework. Turns out Princess Cheryl had approved identical sheds for 3 of her real estate buddies, including one that was actually over the setback line. But somehow those were architectural masterpieces, while mine threatened the very fabric of suburban civilization. The certified mail assault began immediately. Daily violation notices for imaginary infractions, mailbox wrong shade of black, grass a 1/4 inch too tall, garbage cans visible for 30 seconds beyond the sacred time frame. Each envelope carried that distinctive government-issue paper texture and Cheryl's flowery signature, along with another $50 fine. That metallic taste of anxiety became my breakfast companion every morning when the mail truck rumbled down our street. Sarah would watch me open each envelope, her face carrying that particular tension cancer survivors know too well. Except now the threat was financial instead of medical. But here's something you learn in the Navy. Every system has weak points, and every bully eventually overplays their hand. Cheryl's pattern was clearer than a schematic. She wasn't enforcing rules, she was running a protection racket with community bylaws instead of brass knuckles. Then she declared war on my generator. I'd installed backup power after Sarah's treatments started. Medical equipment doesn't negotiate with blackouts. Professional installation, all permits filed, positioned exactly per county specifications. The diesel engine hummed quieter than most people's refrigerators, a steady mechanical heartbeat that meant safety for my family. Cheryl declared it unsightly and potentially hazardous, demanding immediate removal for community aesthetics. This from someone whose own backup generator lurked behind decorative lattice like some kind of suburban camouflage operation. Individual convenience doesn't trump community standards, she informed me during what she called an emergency consultation on my front lawn. That's when I really started studying our neighborhood's layout. All those houses sitting below my elevation. All those basement sump pumps working overtime during heavy rains. All those drainage lines running uphill toward my property. Suddenly, Cheryl's war on my generator looked like the kind of strategic blunder that sinks battleships. 3 weeks later, Mother Nature decided to throw the first punch in what would become the Great Willowbrook Heights Water War. The ice storm hit Tuesday night like God's own temper tantrum. Power lines snapped under ice weight, transforming our suburban paradise into a frozen hellscape. The sound of cracking branches echoed through darkness like distant artillery, while the acrid smell of electrical fires mixed with the sharp bite of sub-zero air. By Wednesday morning, the entire county was dark except for one house. Mine. My diesel generator had kicked in automatically, its steady mechanical heartbeat keeping our heat running and Sarah's medical equipment powered. More importantly, it was keeping Mrs. Graham's oxygen concentrator humming next door. At 74 with emphysema, she needed that machine like most people need air, which, technically, she did. That's when Cheryl decided to stage her little intervention. She arrived at 10 a.m. with board members Janet Morrison and Dave Phillips in tow, all three bundled like they were conquering Antarctica. Their breath formed angry clouds as they marched across my ice-slick driveway, Cheryl clutching her clipboard like Moses carrying stone tablets. "Rex!" She pounded my door hard enough to wake the frozen dead. "We need to discuss community cooperation during this emergency." I opened up to find her wearing a parka that probably cost more than my truck, her face red with cold and manufactured outrage. "Your generator needs to be shared immediately," she announced. "It's unconscionable to hoard power while your neighbors suffer." Behind her, the board members nodded like dashboard bobbleheads, though I caught them eyeing my warm, well-lit house with naked envy. "Happy to help," I said, meaning it. "But we need to calculate electrical loads first. Overload this thing and everyone loses power, including Mrs. Graham's oxygen." Back in the Navy, I'd seen what happened when people ignored electrical capacity limits. A destroyer. I served on lost power for 6 hours because some genius thought he could run everything at once. The lesson stuck. Respect the physics, or the physics will bite you in the ass. "We don't need an engineering lecture," Cheryl snapped. "We need extension cords run to board members' houses. This is about community spirit, something you clearly lack." "Cheryl, if I overload the system, Mrs. Graham could literally die." Her face cycled through several interesting colors before settling on entitled white woman red. "There's always an excuse with you, always putting yourself first." That's when she played her trump card. "Fine. The board is implementing Emergency Rule 47B, effective immediately. All generators must be operated under HOA supervision during community emergencies, or shut down entirely." I blinked. "Emergency Rule 47B? You just made that up." "The board has emergency powers during declared disasters," she said with a smug smile that would have made Satan jealous. "Check your CC and Rs, Section 12, Subsection 4. And here's the thing. She was actually right. Buried in the fine print of our covenants was a clause giving the board emergency management authority during officially declared disasters. I'd read those documents when we bought the house, but honestly, Who memorizes HOA legalese? You have 24 hours to comply, Cheryl continued. Share the generator with board members, or we shut it down for code violations. After they left, trailing threats and self-righteousness, I did what any good engineer does when facing an impossible problem. I gathered intelligence. That afternoon, while Cheryl was presumably drafting more emergency rules, I took a reconnaissance walk through our frozen wasteland of a neighborhood. What I'd been subconsciously noticing suddenly snapped into focus with mathematical precision. Every single house in Willowbrook Heights sat below my property's elevation. Every single one. I'd thought this was just lucky drainage when we bought the place, but studying the terrain with an engineer's eye revealed something far more interesting. This wasn't accident. It was design. The original 1960s developer had used natural topography to create a gravity-fed stormwater system, with all drainage flowing uphill to collection points at the highest elevation. My elevation. That evening, powered by my soon-to-be contraband generator, I dove into county records online. The original subdivision plat from 1963 made my pulse quicken like I'd struck oil. There, marked in faded engineering ink, was a concrete utility vault on my property containing manual override controls for the neighborhood's entire drainage system. Every house had electric sump pumps designed to push basement water uphill during storms. But when those pumps lost power, say during ice storms, the system relied on manual relief valves to prevent catastrophic backups. Valves controlled from my backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, following the buried utility lines marked on the blueprints. Hidden under decades of leaves and neglect, I found it. A concrete vault the size of a washing machine, sealed with a heavy metal cover that opened with a satisfying mechanical click. Inside were 6 valve wheels, each labeled for different neighborhood zones. Zone 4, serving the lowest elevation houses, including Cheryl's, had its own dedicated control. As I stood there in the frozen darkness, studying those valves by flashlight, one thought crystallized. Cheryl wanted to control my generator, but I controlled something much more fundamental. I controlled gravity itself. The next morning brought melting ice, rising water levels, and Cheryl's declaration of total war. I was bringing Mrs. Graham her morning coffee, her kitchen still powerless after 36 hours, when diesel engines rumbled into my driveway. Through her frost-etched window, I watched a county inspector's truck arrive, followed immediately by Cheryl's white BMW and 2 news vans. News vans. Smart play, I admitted grudgingly. Can't beat me with inspectors? Try public pressure. Mrs. Graham adjusted her oxygen tube with fingers that trembled slightly in the cold. In China we say, when you cannot win the battle, change the war. But sometimes, the war changes you first. Prophetic words from a woman who'd lived through actual wars, not suburban power struggles. Outside, Cheryl was already performing for the cameras, gesturing dramatically at my generator, while County Inspector Williams looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "This is unconscionable," she declared to Channel 7's morning crew. "One family hoarding power while elderly neighbors freeze in the dark. Where's the community spirit? Where's basic human decency?" Beautiful theater. Too bad she hadn't counted on me knowing the script. I strolled outside, coffee in hand, just as Williams fired up his sound meter. 42 decibels from the property line. Quieter than a normal conversation. He documented everything with the resignation of a man trapped in someone else's drama. "Equipment meets all safety and noise requirements," Williams announced to the cameras. "No violations." Cheryl's smile never wavered, but her eyes went Arctic cold. "Then we'll address this through proper community channels." That's when she played her ace card. "Mr. Holloway," she said loudly enough for the microphones to catch, "the board is calling an emergency meeting tonight to discuss equitable power distribution during community crises. 7 p.m. Mandatory attendance for all residents." The reporters ate it up. Suburban drama with a social justice angle? Ratings gold. But here's what Cheryl didn't know. I'd spent the previous evening doing actual research instead of planning TV appearances. 22 years in the Navy teaches you that when someone declares war, you better understand the battlefield better than they do. That evening, Cheryl's living room was packed beyond fire code capacity. Board members, neighbors, even some folks from adjacent streets, all drawn by the promise of free entertainment and the lingering smell of her aggressive vanilla candles mixed with nervous sweat. "The board has determined," Cheryl announced like she was reading a royal decree, "that individual generator operation during emergencies creates dangerous inequities and safety hazards." She'd prepared a full dog and pony show, charts about power consumption, dramatic photos of my industrial-scale generator, even a petition demanding community power sharing, signed by neighbors who didn't even live in our HOA. When she finished her performance, I stood slowly. Back in the Navy, I'd learned that the most devastating weapon isn't the biggest gun. It's the most precise shot fired at exactly the right moment. "Cheryl, that's fascinating," I said, pulling out a thick folder. "But before we vote on shutting down life support equipment, maybe the board should know what they're actually voting on." I opened the folder like it contained nuclear launch codes, which, in a way, it did. See, my generator doesn't just power my house, it also maintains the emergency communications repeater hidden in my attic, the one that provides 911 service for this entire neighborhood during power outages. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the vanilla candles seemed to stop flickering. "Cut my power, and you're not just inconveniencing me. You're eliminating emergency communications for 67 households. That's a federal crime under Title 18, Section 1362, willful injury to communications infrastructure during a declared disaster." And I pulled out the documentation. FCC registration, emergency management protocols, federal statutes with their delightfully specific criminal penalties. The penalty for that particular crime is up to 20 years in federal prison. Not county jail, not community service, federal prison. Because apparently, the government takes emergency communications seriously. Cheryl had gone white as printer paper. You can't threaten board members. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining federal law, which, coincidentally, supersedes HOA bylaws every single time. That's when I dropped the real bombshell. "But here's the interesting part," I continued, flipping to another page. "I also discovered something about our neighborhood's drainage system while researching emergency protocols. Turns out the original developer installed manual override controls for all the basement sump pumps, controls that are located on my property." I let that sink in for exactly 3 seconds. "So the board has a choice. Leave my generator alone and maintain both emergency communications and flood protection, or shut down my power and explain to insurance companies why 67 basements flooded due to HOA interference with emergency infrastructure." The room was dead silent, except for Cheryl's grandfather clock ticking like a time bomb. The board voted 5-0 to table the generator issue indefinitely. Even Cheryl voted against herself rather than commit federal crimes on record. But as neighbors filed out, avoiding eye contact like they'd witnessed a murder, I knew this was just round one. Cheryl had lost the public battle, which meant she was about to try something much more private, much more dangerous. 2 nights later, I learned that embarrassing a petty tyrant on live television doesn't make them retreat. It makes them homicidal. The sound that jolted me awake at 2:17 a.m., was all wrong. Instead of my generator's familiar diesel purr, I heard sharp metallic grinding followed by electrical silence. My bedside clock went dark, the house settling into that particular quiet that means total power failure. Someone had just murdered my generator. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, my bare feet instantly regretting the frozen concrete. What I found in my flashlight beam made me want to commit actual murder. My power cable severed clean through with bolt cutters, copper ends gleaming like exposed bone. But here's the thing about living with a cancer survivor. You learn to think clearly when everything goes to hell. Sarah appeared beside me in her robe, assessed the sabotage with one glance, and said exactly what I was thinking. "Call 911, now." Except my phone showed no signal bars, because the communications repeater in my attic had just died along with everything else. I fired up my truck and drove to the police station, leaving Sarah to check on Mrs. Graham with a battery lantern. The drive through our dark neighborhood felt like navigating a war zone, the acrid smell of electrical burn still clinging to my jacket. Officer Martinez took my statement with professional weariness. "Any suspects in mind?" HOA president who just got publicly humiliated for trying to shut down life support equipment. He nodded, scribbling notes. "We'll dust for prints, canvas for witnesses. Meanwhile, consider upgrading your security." When I got home, Sarah had devastating news. Mrs. Graham's oxygen concentrator was running on battery backup, good for maybe 4 hours. We'd loaded her into the truck and driven across town to her daughter's house, where she could plug into grid power. "She was turning blue," Sarah said quietly, as we stood in our powerless kitchen. Another hour, and the metallic taste of pure rage flooded my mouth. Cheryl hadn't just vandalized my property, she'd attempted murder by proxy. And Mrs. Graham had almost paid the price for my war with a suburban sociopath. But 22 years in the Navy teaches you something valuable. When someone tries to kill you, you don't get emotional. You get systematic. I spent the next day installing a surveillance system that would make the NSA jealous. High-definition cameras with night vision, motion sensors, cloud backup, and enough redundancy to survive a nuclear attack. If Cheryl so much as breathed on my property again, I'd have 4K footage of it. While the cameras uploaded their first test recordings, I did something else. I investigated Cheryl Blackwood with the thoroughness of a war crimes tribunal. What I discovered was absolutely beautiful in its criminal stupidity. HOA fees had jumped 127% over 3 years, supposedly for infrastructure improvements. But the actual contracts told a different story. Every major maintenance job, landscaping, snow removal, repairs, went to Blackwood Landscaping, owned by Cheryl's husband, at rates that would make defense contractors blush. Lawn care for our common areas. Market rate $800 monthly, charged $2,400. Tree trimming, market rate $1,200 annually, charged $4,800. The pattern repeated for every service contract over 3 years. Total embezzlement, $53,000 and counting. But the real beauty was in the property records. Cheryl and her husband had been buying distressed properties in adjacent neighborhoods using inflated HOA contracts to artificially boost property values in Willowbrook Heights, then flipping their acquisitions at massive profits. Classic fraud, wrapped in community service rhetoric. I also learned something delicious about emergency management law. When someone sabotages critical infrastructure during a declared disaster, they become personally liable for all consequences. If Mrs. Graham had died because she couldn't call 911 due to lost communications, Cheryl could face federal homicide charges. That evening brought an Oscar-worthy performance from Cheryl herself. "Rex," she said at my door around sunset, wearing an expression of concern that wouldn't fool a brain-dead goldfish. "I heard about the terrible vandalism. Crime is really escalating in our neighborhood." I leaned against the doorframe, studying her like an interesting bacterial culture. "Funny thing about crime, Cheryl. These new 4K security cameras capture everything. Amazing what modern technology can accomplish." Her mask of sympathy developed several small cracks. "I'm sure the police will apprehend whoever committed this horrible act." "Oh, absolutely, especially since the FBI took over the case this morning." That got her full attention. Her pupils dilated slightly. Fear response. Classic tell. "The FBI? Sabotaging emergency communications during a federal disaster declaration qualifies as domestic terrorism under the Patriot Act." Agent Rodriguez seemed fascinated by the HOA angle. I showed her my phone with the case file number. Apparently, they have extensive experience with small-scale tyrants who endanger lives for petty revenge. Cheryl's face cycled through panic, calculation, and desperate bravado before settling on pure terror. "Well, I should let you return to your repairs." As she scurried away like a rat abandoning ship, I knew the endgame was approaching. Cheryl now understood that I had the evidence, the resources, and the federal backing to destroy her completely, which meant she was about to attempt something absolutely insane. Something that would give me the perfect excuse to unleash 40 years of accumulated spring melt directly into her basement. 3 days after the cable cutting incident, while waiting for FBI forensics and dodging Cheryl's increasingly unhinged behavior, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was in my workshop, rewiring the generator connections with theft-proof conduit, when I found the manila envelope tucked behind my workbench. The previous homeowner had left it there, probably forgotten during the chaos of moving. Inside were the original 1963 subdivision blueprints, complete engineering specifications, and something that made my pulse quicken, like I'd found buried treasure. A handwritten note from the original developer. "Emergency flood control procedures. Read carefully." What I learned over the next hour of studying those yellowed documents was absolutely perfect. Our neighborhood sat in what used to be a natural drainage basin. When the developer built Willowbrook Heights, he'd engineered an elegant solution, a gravity-fed stormwater system with my property as the high-ground control center. Every basement sump pump in the neighborhood pushed water uphill through pressurized lines to collection points on my land. But here's the genius part. The system included manual override controls for emergencies. If the electric pumps failed during power outages, property owners could manually manage drainage flow to prevent catastrophic flooding. Those controls were housed in the concrete vault I'd already discovered, but the blueprints revealed something crucial I'd missed. Each of the 6 valve wheels controlled specific drainage zones with surgical precision. Zone 1, the high-elevation houses with minimal flood risk. Zone 2, mid-level properties with moderate drainage needs. Zones 3 through 5, progressively lower elevations with increasing flood vulnerability. And Zone 6, the lowest lying area of the neighborhood, including Cheryl's house and 5 others. Close those valves, and that zone would flood within 45 minutes during heavy water flow. The engineering notes were even more revealing. During my Navy career, I'd seen similar systems on bases in flood-prone areas. The principle was elegantly simple. Control water pressure at the choke point, and you control everything downstream. Basic hydraulics, the same physics that power everything from car brakes to hydraulic lifts. But the real game changer was buried in the legal documentation. According to state emergency management law, private citizens who operate critical infrastructure during declared emergencies receive broad liability protection. Translation: as long as I followed life safety protocols during disaster declarations, I couldn't be held responsible for property damage resulting from emergency operations. Even better, the original developer had filed this drainage system with the county as emergency flood control infrastructure. That meant it fell under the same legal protections as dams, levees, and other critical systems. During emergencies, Operation prioritized human safety over property protection, a principle backed by decades of legal precedent. I cross-referenced this with current county emergency declarations. The ice storm was still classified as an ongoing disaster due to continued power outages and infrastructure damage. That classification gave me legal authority to operate the drainage controls according to emergency protocols until the declaration ended. The implications hit me like lightning. I could legally prioritize drainage for houses with medical equipment, elderly residents, or families with small children. Properties without life safety concerns would naturally receive lower priority. If that resulted in temporary flooding for some basements, well, that was just the unfortunate mathematics of emergency triage. I spent the rest of the afternoon studying water table maps and weather forecasts. Spring was coming early this year, with temperatures expected to spike into the 60s within a week. When that happened, 40 years of accumulated snow and ice would melt rapidly, creating maximum pressure on the drainage system. Perfect timing for a practical demonstration of emergency management principles. That evening, I walked the neighborhood with new eyes, mentally mapping the drama that was about to unfold. Mrs. Graham's house. Zone 2, priority drainage due to medical equipment. The Kowalski family with their newborn. Zone 1, maximum protection. The Morrison family who'd supported my generator rights. Zone 3, adequate drainage maintained. And Cheryl's house, sitting smugly in Zone 6 like a target painted bright white. Lowest priority during emergency operations, because when you try to murder your neighbors for keeping medical equipment running, you forfeit your right to flood protection. The best part? Everything I was planning was completely legal, thoroughly documented, and perfectly justified under emergency management protocols. Cheryl had started this war by cutting my power during a disaster. I was going to finish it by controlling hers during a flood. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather and the perfect opportunity to test my newfound authority over the neighborhood's aquatic destiny. I started with legitimate preparation, the kind that would look absolutely reasonable to any investigating authority. First stop, the County Emergency Management Office, where I filed an official Emergency Infrastructure Operation Plan for the Willowbrook Heights drainage system. Coordinator Janet Walsh was impressed. "This is exactly the kind of proactive planning we need from private citizens," she said, reviewing my documentation. "You're essentially volunteering as neighborhood flood control coordinator." "Just trying to protect life safety during the ongoing emergency," I replied, with the sincerity of a Boy Scout. "Priority goes to houses with medical equipment and vulnerable residents, naturally." She stamped my paperwork with official approval. Now I had government authorization for everything I was about to do. Back home, I began what I privately called meteorological warfare planning. The weather forecast showed a perfect storm of flooding conditions, temperatures spiking to 65 degrees by Thursday, combined with steady rain that would accelerate snowmelt. The accumulated snow and ice from our recent storms would dump approximately 40 years' worth of water into the drainage system over a 48-hour period. I calculated the hydraulic loads with the precision of an artillery officer plotting targeting coordinates. Normal conditions. All zones open. Manageable water flow. Minimal basement seepage. emergency conditions with selective zone control, surgical flooding capability with precise timing. The mathematics were beautiful. Close the valves for Zone 6, and water pressure would back up through the underground lines like a champagne cork, exploding backwards. Cheryl's basement would start flooding in approximately 47 minutes, reaching ankle-deep water within 2 hours and achieving full saturation within 4 hours. More importantly, I could control the timeline precisely. Emergency restoration of drainage, should life safety require it, could be accomplished in under 10 minutes by reopening the valves. Time to rally my allies and prepare for the show. I started with Mrs. Graham, who was back home after her daughter had installed a backup battery system for her oxygen concentrator. The old woman listened to my explanation with the shrewd intelligence of someone who'd survived actual wars, not just suburban ones. "You're going to flood that terrible woman's house," she said with satisfaction. "Good. In China, we have saying, when someone spits in your rice bowl, you don't wash the bowl, you make them eat the spit." I helped Mrs. Graham move her valuables to higher ground and showed her how to shut off her basement electrical systems safely. "Just precautionary," I explained. "Spring flooding can be unpredictable." The Kowalskis were next. Jim and Maria had a 6-month-old baby and had been vocal supporters during the generator controversy. I explained the flood risk assessment and helped them waterproof their basement. "Cheryl's been making our lives hell for 2 years," Maria said, while we moved boxes upstairs. "If her basement floods because she cut power to medical equipment, that's karma, not crime." By Wednesday evening, I'd quietly warned every household with legitimate life safety concerns. Elderly residents, families with medical equipment, households with small children. All received flood preparation assistance and priority drainage guarantees. I documented every conversation, creating an unbreakable paper trail of responsible emergency management. Meanwhile, I prepared the technical aspects with military precision. I installed waterproof cameras in the utility vault to record all valve operations with timestamps. I created detailed logs showing water level monitoring, weather tracking, and drainage decisions based on emergency protocols. Most importantly, I tested the valve systems to ensure smooth operation. Each valve wheel required significant torque to operate, clearly designed for emergency use by determined individuals. The mechanical precision reminded me of submarine systems, robust, reliable, and unforgiving of operator error. Thursday morning arrived with temperatures already climbing toward 60 degrees and light rain beginning to fall. Perfect conditions for the practical demonstration of emergency drainage management that I'd been planning. I put on my official emergency management vest, purchased specifically for today's activities, and walked out to the utility vault with my documentation, tools, and cameras. The concrete cover opened with a satisfying mechanical click, revealing the 6 valve wheels that controlled the neighborhood's hydraulic destiny. According to my emergency operation plan, filed with county authorities and approved by emergency management, drainage priorities would be assigned based on life safety criteria. Medical equipment, elderly residents, and families with children would receive maximum protection. Properties without life safety concerns would receive drainage resources as available, consistent with emergency triage principles. I checked my watch, 8:47 a.m. Weather radar showed the main precipitation band arriving within 2 hours. Time to begin emergency operations. I photographed the initial valve positions, documented the weather conditions, and made the first entry in my official emergency management log. Beginning drainage operations per approved emergency plan. Priority given to life safety as required by state emergency protocols. Then I reached for the Zone 6 valve wheel and began turning it clockwise. The sound of rushing water immediately changed pitch as pressure backed up through the underground lines. Let the games begin. By Friday morning, I had achieved what military strategists call information dominance. I knew exactly what was happening throughout the neighborhood while my enemies fumbled around in the dark. My drainage operations were proceeding flawlessly. Zones 1 through 5 maintained perfect water management, protecting every household with legitimate life safety concerns. Zone 6, however, was experiencing what my emergency reports diplomatically called reduced drainage capacity due to system limitations during peak flow conditions. Translation: Cheryl's basement was slowly filling with water, and she was losing her mind. The beauty of my position was its complete legal invulnerability. Every decision was documented, every action justified under approved emergency protocols, every outcome the predictable result of hydraulic physics and emergency triage principles, which made Cheryl's escalating panic absolutely delicious to observe. She started with denial. Thursday afternoon, I watched through my security cameras as she waded around her basement in rubber boots, frantically operating a shop vacuum like it could defeat the laws of physics. The woman was literally trying to vacuum her way out of a flood. By Thursday evening, she'd moved to bargaining. My doorbell rang at 7:23 p.m., and I found Cheryl on my doorstep wearing the kind of forced smile usually reserved for hostage videos. "Rex," she said, her voice tight with artificial pleasantness, "I'm having some minor water issues in my basement. I was wondering if you knew anything about the neighborhood drainage system." I adjusted my emergency management vest, I'd taken to wearing it constantly during operations, and consulted my clipboard with professional concern. "Water issues? That's concerning. Have you checked your sump pump?" "My sump pump is running constantly, but the water keeps rising." Her smile was developing stress fractures around the edges. "I thought maybe, with your engineering background..." "Ah, yes. Spring flooding can be unpredictable during emergency conditions." I showed her my official documentation. "I'm currently operating the manual drainage controls under county authorization. Priority goes to life safety concerns, naturally." And her mask slipped completely. "Life safety? I have life safety concerns." "Of course. Do you have medical equipment? Elderly residents? Small children?" No, but then, according to emergency protocols, your property receives drainage resources as available after higher priority locations are secured." I made a note on my clipboard. "I'll certainly review the situation when current operations permit." She stormed away, leaving wet footprints on my doormat like an angry trail of breadcrumbs. Friday brought escalation to Phase 2. Desperate measures. At 6:15 a.m., my motion sensors triggered as someone approached the utility vault. Security cameras showed Cheryl and her husband Dave creeping across my property with bolt cutters and a flashlight, apparently planning to tamper with the drainage controls directly. They should have remembered that I was a retired Navy electronics specialist with a paranoid streak and unlimited time to plan. The vault was locked with a military-grade padlock that could survive artillery strikes. But even if they'd brought actual explosives, they would have encountered my backup security measure: motion-activated spotlights bright enough to illuminate a football stadium, along with speakers playing a recording of my voice. "Attention! You are tampering with emergency infrastructure during a declared disaster. This activity is being recorded and transmitted to county emergency management and federal authorities. Cease immediately or face criminal prosecution." Watching Cheryl and Dave scramble away like vampires fleeing sunrise was worth every penny I'd spent on that security system. But Friday afternoon brought her most desperate gambit yet. She called the media. Channel 7's news van pulled up at 4 p.m., followed by Cheryl wearing her most photogenic outfit and an expression of righteous victimization that deserved an Emmy nomination. "This is environmental terrorism," she declared to the cameras, while standing ankle-deep in her flooded basement. "One neighbor controlling drainage to punish others for following community rules." The reporter, Mike Stevens, seemed genuinely concerned. "Mrs. Blackwood, You're alleging that a neighbor is deliberately flooding your home? Absolutely. Rex Holloway has been operating some kind of water control system to retaliate against the HOA board for enforcing generator regulations. Stevens turned to interview me as I approached wearing my official emergency vest and carrying a clipboard thick with documentation. Mr. Holloway, how do you respond to these accusations? I'm operating critical infrastructure under County Emergency Management Authorization, I replied calmly, showing him my official paperwork. Mrs. Blackwood's property is receiving drainage resources consistent with emergency triage protocols. Triage protocols? During disasters, emergency responders prioritize life safety over property protection. Households with medical equipment and vulnerable residents receive priority drainage. Properties without life safety concerns receive resources as available. Stevens studied my documentation while Cheryl sputtered in the background. These appear to be official county documents. Absolutely. I'm following the same protocols used by professional emergency management teams. Everything is documented, authorized, and legally required under state emergency law. What Cheryl didn't know, and what made this moment absolutely perfect, was that the county emergency coordinator was watching the live broadcast from her office, probably wondering why some HOA president was attacking a volunteer emergency worker on television. My phone buzzed with a text from Coordinator Walsh. Great job managing neighborhood drainage. Keep up the good work. Game, set, and match. Saturday morning brought the grand finale of Cheryl's descent into complete delusion. She was going to make me an offer I couldn't refuse. The doorbell rang at precisely 9 a.m., interrupting my morning coffee and emergency management logs. Through the peephole, I saw Cheryl flanked by two men in cheap suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a mob movie. If the mob recruited from failed used car lots. Rex, Cheryl said when I opened the door, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of poisoned honey. I'd like you to meet my attorneys, Donald Kravitz and Michael Romano from Kravitz and Associates. I almost laughed. Almost. These weren't attorneys. They were the kind of legal consultants who worked out of strip mall offices and specialized in frivolous lawsuits and intimidation tactics. The smell of cheap cologne and desperation wafted off them like a toxic cloud. Mr. Holloway, Kravitz announced in a voice that probably sounded threatening to suburban soccer moms. My client has suffered significant property damage due to your reckless operation of drainage equipment. We're prepared to file suit for damages, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and criminal mischief. I leaned against my doorframe, sipping coffee and studying them like interesting specimens in a zoo. Fascinating. Tell me, gentlemen, are you familiar with federal emergency management law? We're familiar with property rights and civil damages, Romano replied. What you're doing is illegal flooding of private property. Actually, what I'm doing is operating critical infrastructure under county emergency authorization during a declared disaster. I pulled out my phone and showed them my official documentation. Everything I've done is not only legal, it's legally required under state emergency protocols. Kravitz squinted at my screen like he was trying to read hieroglyphics. Emergency protocols don't give you the right to flood people's basements. You're absolutely correct. They give me the authority to prioritize life safety over property protection during disasters. Mrs. Blackwood's basement is flooding because her property doesn't qualify for priority drainage under emergency triage criteria. Cheryl couldn't contain herself anymore. This is ridiculous. I demand you stop this immediately. I'm afraid that's not possible. Once emergency operations begin, they continue until the disaster declaration ends, or all life safety concerns are resolved. Stopping now would actually be a violation of my legal obligations. That's when Cheryl played her final, desperate card. Fine, she snapped. The HOA board is calling an emergency meeting for Sunday morning. We're voting to remove you from the neighborhood entirely." I blinked. Remove me? From my own property? "We're invoking the Community Standards Clause to declare you a nuisance resident. The board can force sale of properties that threaten community welfare." Now I did laugh, a genuine belly laugh that made all three of them step backwards. "Cheryl, you can't just vote someone out of their own house. That's not how property ownership works." "We'll see about that," she huffed. "Sunday morning, 10 a.m., mandatory appearance." After they left, trailing legal threats and wounded dignity, I made a phone call that would end this farce permanently. "Agent Rodriguez, this is Rex Holloway. Remember that domestic terrorism case involving sabotaged emergency communications? I need to report an escalation." I explained the latest developments: attempted tampering with emergency infrastructure, fraudulent legal threats, and attempts to interfere with authorized emergency operations. Rodriguez listened with the patience of someone who'd dealt with small-town corruption before. "Mr. Holloway, we've been building a case against Mrs. Blackwood for several days. The surveillance footage you provided shows clear evidence of infrastructure sabotage. We're also investigating financial irregularities in the HOA accounts." "Financial irregularities? Your embezzlement documentation was very thorough. We've identified approximately $53,000 in fraudulent contracts over 3 years. Federal prosecutors are preparing charges for mail fraud, conspiracy, and terrorism-related offenses." Perfect. Sunday's emergency meeting was going to be more eventful than Cheryl anticipated. That evening, I performed one final check of my drainage operations. Water levels throughout the neighborhood were perfectly managed. Life safety priorities maintained perfect drainage, while Zone 6 continued experiencing capacity limitations that had left Cheryl's basement resembling an indoor swimming pool. My security cameras showed her house with water damage restoration trucks parked outside, industrial pumps running continuously, and Cheryl herself visible through her kitchen window, gesticulating wildly at someone on the phone. Tomorrow's emergency meeting would be her last stand, a desperate attempt to use HOA bureaucracy to overturn federal law and basic physics. But I had something she didn't expect. About 6 federal agents, complete embezzlement evidence, terrorism charges, and approximately 40 years of accumulated spring runoff that was about to become Exhibit A in a federal prosecution. Sunday morning was going to be absolutely spectacular. I raised my coffee mug in a toast to the surveillance camera monitoring Cheryl's flooded basement. Here's to emergency management, federal law, and the immutable principles of hydraulic engineering. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting physics and law enforcement do their jobs. Sunday morning arrived with perfect spring weather and the sweet promise of total vindication. I walked to Cheryl's house for the emergency meeting, wearing my official emergency management vest and carrying enough documentation to sink a battleship. The scene outside her house was absolutely glorious. 3 water damage restoration trucks were parked in her driveway, industrial pumps roaring like jet engines, and enough emergency lighting to illuminate a construction site. Her white BMW sat abandoned on the street, presumably because her garage was underwater. Inside, Cheryl's living room had been transformed into what looked like a disaster zone command center. Folding tables covered with soggy paperwork, dehumidifiers running at maximum volume, and the unmistakable smell of water damage mixing with her usual aggressive vanilla candles. About 20 neighbors had shown up for the spectacle, including Mrs. Graham, the Kowalskis, and several others who'd been supporting my generator rights from the beginning. They sat in folding chairs arranged around Cheryl's makeshift podium, watching her pace back and forth like a caged animal. "Thank you all for coming," Cheryl began, her voice tight with barely controlled hysteria. We're here to address the environmental terrorism that's been inflicted on our community. She gestured dramatically toward her basement, where the sound of industrial pumps provided an appropriate soundtrack. Rex Holloway has been deliberately flooding homes to retaliate against legitimate HOA enforcement. This cannot continue. I raised my hand politely. Point of order, Cheryl. I'm operating emergency infrastructure under federal authorization. Everything I've done is documented and approved. Approved by who? She demanded. County Emergency Management, for starters. I held up my paperwork. Also the Army Corps of Engineers, since this drainage system affects federal flood control measures. Oh, and the FBI, since you tried to sabotage critical infrastructure during a declared emergency. The room went dead quiet, except for the mechanical symphony of water pumps and dehumidifiers. That's when Agent Rodriguez walked through the front door. He was exactly what you'd expect from federal law enforcement. Tall, serious, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and carrying the kind of authority that makes guilty people start sweating immediately. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, displaying his badge with ceremonial precision. Agent Rodriguez, FBI. We need to discuss your recent activities. Cheryl's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on panic white. This is a private HOA meeting. Actually, it's evidence of ongoing criminal activity, specifically terrorism, mail fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. He gestured toward me. Mr. Holloway's been assisting our investigation into infrastructure sabotage and financial crimes. The neighbors were now watching like this was better than cable television. Mrs. Graham was openly smiling. The Kowalskis were recording everything on their phones, and several others looked like they were trying not to applaud. Rodriguez continued with professional ruthlessness. We have surveillance footage of you cutting power cables to emergency communications equipment during a federal disaster declaration. We also have evidence of systematic embezzlement through fraudulent HOA contracts totaling $53,000. That's completely fabricated, Cheryl stammered. We have bank records, contract documents, and testimony from multiple contractors about inflated billing schemes. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. Your husband's landscaping company alone overbilled the HOA by $31,000 over 2 years. He turned to address the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwood has been systematically defrauding this HOA while using her position to harass residents who questioned her authority. The flooding of her basement is the direct result of emergency drainage operations that prioritize life safety over property protection, exactly as required by federal law. That's when I delivered the moment I'd been planning for weeks. Agent Rodriguez, for the record, would you explain why Mrs. Blackwood's property receives lower priority during emergency drainage operations? Certainly. Federal emergency management protocols prioritize households with medical equipment, elderly residents, and families with small children. Properties without life safety concerns receive drainage resources as available, consistent with disaster triage principles used by professional emergency responders. I gestured toward my neighbors. Mrs. Graham requires oxygen equipment. The Kowalskis have a 6-month-old baby. The Hendersons are in their 70s. All of these households receive priority drainage under emergency protocols. And Mrs. Blackwood's property? No medical equipment, no elderly residents, no small children. During emergency operations, her property receives drainage resources after life safety priorities are secured. Rodriguez nodded. Which means Mr. Holloway's drainage decisions are not only legal, they're legally required under federal emergency management standards. Cheryl looked around the room desperately, seeking support that had evaporated like morning dew. Her board members were studying their shoes, neighbors were openly laughing, and the sound of water pumps provided a perfect soundtrack to her humiliation. Mrs. Cheryl Blackwood, Rodriguez announced formally, you're under arrest for terrorism, mail fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." As handcuffs clicked around Cheryl's wrists, Mrs. Graham started applauding slowly. The Kowalskis joined in, then the Hendersons, until the entire room was giving Rodriguez the kind of standing ovation usually reserved for war heroes. And through it all, the industrial pumps kept running, fighting a losing battle against 40 years of spring runoff and the immutable laws of hydraulic engineering. Justice, it turns out, flows downhill. 6 months later, I was sitting in my workshop on a perfect September morning, reading a letter that made everything worthwhile. "Dear Mr. Holloway," it began, "on behalf of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, we would like to commend your exemplary performance during the Willowbrook Heights flooding incident. Your professional operation of critical infrastructure under emergency conditions prevented potential loss of life while maintaining strict adherence to federal protocols." The letter was signed by the regional FEMA director and included an official commendation for civilian emergency management service. It now hangs framed on my workshop wall, right next to a photo of Cheryl being led away in handcuffs. The aftermath had been swift and decisive. Cheryl received 18 months in federal prison for terrorism and embezzlement, plus restitution payments that would keep her broke until roughly 2035. Her husband got 6 months for conspiracy and lost his landscaping business when clients discovered his fraudulent billing practices. More importantly, the HOA recovered every penny of the stolen money, $53,000 that we immediately put to good use. The first purchase was a neighborhood emergency communication system, weather radios, backup power supplies, and medical alert equipment for elderly residents. Mrs. Graham was especially pleased with her new oxygen concentrator with extended battery backup. We also established the Willowbrook Heights Emergency Preparedness Fund, which provides grants for residents to install backup generators, sump pump systems, and flood protection equipment. Because when your neighborhood learns that one person with drainage control can protect everyone or flood anyone, people get serious about emergency planning. The new HOA board, elected unanimously after Cheryl's arrest, made me the official emergency management coordinator, a position that comes with legal authority over neighborhood infrastructure and absolutely no tolerance for petty bureaucratic nonsense. Property values in our neighborhood increased 23% over 6 months. Turns out buyers really appreciate communities with professional emergency management, documented flood protection, and recent experience purging corrupt leadership. The real estate listings now advertise Federal Emergency Management Certified as a selling point. But the real victory was personal. Sarah's medical bills were finally paid off, partly from my new consulting contract with the County Emergency Management Office, and partly from the speaking fees I earned teaching emergency preparedness workshops. Turns out there's significant demand for someone who can explain how to legally flood corrupt officials while maintaining perfect compliance with federal law. I've developed standardized emergency protocols for 12 other subdivisions, all based on the Willowbrook Heights model. The State Emergency Management Agency now uses my documentation as the template for private infrastructure operation during disasters. The technical manual I wrote, Residential Emergency Management, a practical guide to community preparedness, became required reading for county emergency coordinators statewide. Chapter 7, Drainage System Operation During Flood Events, is particularly popular. Mrs. Graham celebrated her 75th birthday last month with a party in my workshop. She insisted on making dumplings for 60 people and giving a toast that brought several neighbors to tears. In China, we say that good neighbors are better than distant relatives. Rex proved that good neighbors are better than corrupt officials, incompetent lawyers, and gravity combined. The Kowalski's baby is now walking and has apparently decided that my workshop is the most fascinating place in the universe. Little Sarah Kowalski, yes, they named her after my wife, loves the sound of power tools and has already learned to say generator with perfect clarity. We hold monthly emergency preparedness meetings in my workshop, which have evolved into neighborhood social gatherings with practical benefits. Last month's topic was home security systems that actually work, featuring detailed demonstrations of motion sensors, security cameras, and recording equipment suitable for documenting criminal activity. The emergency exercises we conduct are legendary. Every household knows how to operate manual drainage controls, prioritize medical equipment during power outages, and document everything for legal purposes. We may be the only subdivision in America where residents practice emergency protocols with the enthusiasm usually reserved for football tailgating. Every spring, when the snow melts and water levels rise, I walk out to the utility vault and check the valve wheels that control our neighborhood's hydraulic destiny. The brass fittings gleam in the sunlight, ready for whatever emergency might arise.